Good afternoon, everybody. Hope everybody's having a good day today. I'm really glad to start this webinar. I'm really glad that we have Devon here from the City of Toronto, who can give us a tour through the City of Toronto's existing building strategy. And one of the reasons we really wanted to advance this webinar and get Devon to share the story is that I have seen that, I know myself, I have been suffering at times from the anxiety that comes when you look at the scale up needed in terms of the energy efficiency within our existing building stock and how much work we have ahead of us on this one, that there is this moment of panic or anxiety that kind of comes on to me is like, how the hell are we going to reach the scale up that's needed for the existing building stock? And certainly getting retrofit programs into market is the first one of the first steps associated with it, but it is only the first step. And then advancing the overall ecosystem is really important. And also existing building strategies for how the policies and what are the policies, actions, and pathway for helping us get to the point where we have an environment around us that is conducive to scale up. But I just wanted to it's in some ways, this is an education webinar. It's also an anxiety reduction strategy for folks, because I know that a number of you also feel that same anxiety that I know kicks in for me when I think about the sheer challenge ahead of us on enabling existing buildings to be the climate champions that we know that they can and need to be. So didn't want to highlight, no need to panic, but we can plan for it. And I'm really glad that Devon's here to give us a little bit of a tour through the City of Toronto's existing building strategy. So I did want to I wanted to do a land acknowledgements. I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Erie, Neutral, Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, and the Mississaugas. And I was really quite interested in the land, the land that's under this area was covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which actually is an agreement that took place way before Europeans arrived here. And it was agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe for how they were going to work together to share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. And I really thought this was a very interesting story because it's called the Dish with One Spoon. The dish refers to the Great Lakes whole ecosystem and how it is nurturing all of these different cultures and populations. And the spoon relates to the fact that we are all dependent on this dish. We're all dependent on this dish to Okay, I think I muted for a second. So it's the wampum, and the spoon refers to how we all nourish ourselves and how we all need to work together and not use our resource base as a weapon against each other or be selfish in our resource base. So did want to highlight, I am going to turn this video on. Give me 1 second.
Anyway.
Right, I'm going to start.
So what is reconciliation anyway? There's a number of things that are not reconciliation. Hiring more Indigenous peoples is not reconciliation. Having more artwork in offices is not reconciliation. We should already be doing these things.
Before how I can help comes as a question, I think they first need to understand.
All you need is access to Google, and you'll be able to get onto the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's website and read the report. And even if you don't want to read it, you can read it in YouTube videos. Have it read to you.
And then not just know the truth, but there's the justice part where you actually address and make amends for everything that's happened and is still happening.
The reality is that First Nations kids are still getting between 20 to 50% less funding across every public service.
So until there's no more murder to missing Indigenous women or our people over-incarcerated in prison, how can we skip forward to the fun reconciliation part of things?
There is no federal plan to eliminate those inequalities. And some people say, well, there must There must be a reason for this. But let's take boil water advisories. The government of Canada can get a DART team in the air, fly them to an earthquake zone halfway around the world and get clean water pumping in 24 hours. So why can't they do that for First Nations communities in Canada? We're making choices to allow the racial discrimination to continue. And that's what we need to stop.
We will never get to real truth, justice, and reconciliation until there is a substantial transfer of power, wealth, and resources. And that means lands have to come back. That also means there has to be us sharing in the resources. And it also means a recognition and full implementation of our sovereign right to be self-determining.
When you think about the greatest human rights abuses that were done in Canada, the Chinese head tax, the internment of Japanese Canadians, and residential school, they all have two things in common. First, they were all perpetrated by the Canadian government. And second, we all let it happen because we couldn't watch the injustice and speak up and do something about it. Reconciliation is our chance to learn how to not turn away.
If I help these people in professional positions or positions of power understand what it is Indigenous people have been going through and have gone through, it's going to help my children in school right now. It's going to help their children, and it's going to help, 7 generations.
That's why I never talk about reconciliation without talking about truth, justice, and reconciliation. You won't get that from hanging artwork in an office.
Help TV.
Thanks, everyone. I do have to admit, I am having great fun hunting down these great videos and sharing them with you. So I appreciate you indulging me on that one. And I'm going to stop my sharing now, and I'm going to turn it over to Devon. And Devon, you should be able to share your screen now.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Gabby. Always a pleasure. Just hide my video so I can see more of my screen. All right, so, pardon me?
I said perfect. Thank you so much. Take it away.
Great. So welcome, everyone. Happy to be here talking about Toronto's net zero existing buildings strategy today. So as Gabby's done the land acknowledgement, I'm going to move on and talk about Toronto. And Toronto is home to a very large portion of Southern Ontario's population and a very diverse group of people and buildings. So Transform TO is Toronto's overarching strategy on climate change and resilience. Until 2019, we were looking at a 80% reduction by 2050. And at this time, the climate emergency was declared, where we moved that up to net zero by 2050. And now, just this past December, the net zero strategy has moved that target down to net zero by 2040. So this is pretty ambitious. We have 18 years to get there. And it's closing in very quickly. So I totally understand the anxiety around this. So the guiding principles under Transform TO are a multitude here, where we are looking to advance those principles of equity throughout this, protect our low-income residents, protect affordability, strengthen the local economy, develop our workforce and supply chains, improve health, and contribute to poverty reduction and create resilient communities and infrastructure. So where do our emissions come from? So this is our 2018 data, although 2019 is out now. We're looking at most of these emissions coming from buildings. So breaking that down even further, as we can see from this graph, most of those buildings come from this green and orange portion, which is all residential, and the blue portion makes up the rest, which is the commercial and industrial and institutional. So there's a lot, my big takeaway from that is there's a lot that can be done by individual residents in the city. And breaking this down further by fuel and building type, we look at almost all of those emissions come from burning natural gas, which is really important as this focuses us in on where we need to go. So as a first pitch before we get going, we have quite a few programs in the city to try to support some of this transition, from our guidance and enablement programs, including navigation for bigger buildings, better homes, TO targeted to single family. We work on renewable energy, solar advice. There's an initiative for multi-residential called STEP, portfolio initiatives, financing programs, and what we're going to be talking about today, which is the existing buildings emission strategy, the net zero existing building strategy. So this strategy, it's the comprehensive strategy we have to identify the actions we need to take to get to net zero. So it's a key part of the update that just happened in December, and it was coordinated with our own city building policy. So to start this analysis, the technical analysis in the strategy, we dove into what Toronto's existing building stocks were and the pathways those buildings need to take to get to net zero emissions by 2050. I'll dive into that a little bit more later, but these packages of actions are really what defines where we need to go. And starting from these actions, we define these high-level implementation plan and the timelines to implement. So this strategy, we were seeking to develop a balance between the speed and feasibility. The greenhouse gas emissions reductions is just the tip of the considerations going into this, where we need to be looking at the economic impacts and all of the co-benefits, including resilience, health, equity, and local economic development. So key findings from the strategy: most of our emissions are, 80% emissions reductions are possible across our building stock. So these getting to net zero alone in buildings is not feasible, and without offsets or other measures. The biggest part of this transition is moving off of natural gas and moving to a clean electricity grid. These are critical requirements that need to happen to enable net zero for any jurisdiction. So Ontario's electricity grid is pretty clean, but it's not zero emissions, and we need to shift further towards that. And right now, Ontario is on track to actually increase emissions from its electricity grid over the next decade as nuclear is retired. And, so we need quite a bit of further grid decarbonization. And the other big part of this is that natural gas can no longer have a significant role in building heating systems. So, there's talk of replacing some of this with renewable natural gas, but you can go to the Ontario Energy Board, look at a study they did 5 years ago, and you can see that the potential to create renewable natural gas in Ontario, we can only offset about 10% of our current gas use. So it's not a big part of the solution. Might be a solution for some of the higher temperature processes, but most buildings need to electrify, right? Along with this, we need to upgrade the envelopes of buildings. So the windows, the insulation, doing air sealing. So these are very costly, but they're absolutely necessary to help keep electricity grid demands lower. And they also provide a lot of benefits to the occupants of those buildings in terms of air quality, in terms of being able to shelter in place when there is a power outage, and maintaining a comfortable temperature, and things like noise as well, reducing street noise. So these retrofits for buildings, they're significant net investment for building owners. It's they don't have a simple payback. So we do need financial supports and co-investment from all levels of government and the private sector to enable this transformation, right? And we also concluded that voluntary measures are not enough. Mandatory requirements are necessary. We don't have all of the authorities needed to implement that. So we will be working on this in the near term, but we'll need the support of the province to bring that in as well. So what did we find was possible? So we can reduce the emissions from the existing building sector by about 82%. And to do this, we would be approximately doubling the investment in buildings, in building retrofits, along with the business as planned, we'd be doubling that to include more transformative retrofits. And this is a big increase in economic activity that provides a huge benefit as well to the community. So some of those co-benefits that I touched on before is that improved comfort where when you work on a building envelope, both heating, cooling can help deal with some of the overheating issues that some buildings suffer as well. Improved occupant health through enhanced ventilation that's become such a central point in some of our COVID discussions recently. Improving this resilience for passive survivability. And the projection is you can actually maintain or lower energy costs even when fuel switching. So happy to go into a little bit more detail there later as well. And of course, we're talking about workforce and supply chain development, which can result in increased local jobs. So buildings in Toronto, here's the breakdown. As you can see, huge portion of single family homes. And, the large buildings also, add a complexity of a lot of work to do in the next 18 years. So we broke down these building sectors even further by different clusters, archetypes. We looked at the energy sources for these buildings and a profile of how that energy is used. It's also broken down by size, vintage, cluster. So I think this resulted in 32 unique profiles that generally describe most buildings in Toronto sufficiently for this high level analysis. So here's the 32 clusters. It's really interesting to look at again, coming back to most of the emissions are from residential buildings, that these first two clusters are a quarter of our emissions, and they're all multi-residential buildings. So that's where the most emissions we see are from right now. And half the emissions is from these first categories, where you can see some institutional commercial as well here, and getting into single family as well. So all of these buildings, make this transition. There's 5 key building system areas that need some improvement. We've classified them into these categories. Where the first one you might be able to talk about as plug loads, user controllable loads, the enclosure that we're talking about, so those windows, insulation, air sealing, the heating, ventilation, and air conditioning delivery system. So it might be your piping, your air handlers, that endpoint. The HVAC plant, which is your source of heat or source of cooling, and renewable energy systems that you would help offset your electricity consumption with. So these pathways, these are some of the pathways that we considered for all of these clusters of buildings. So looking at the first ones, like for similar, is the baseline business as planned, upgrades that a building would be going through by 2050 anyways. So you're looking at improved technology, making some small improvement to the baseline. So when you think about a building, you can think about simply, how single pane windows used to be the standard. If a building did a like for similar upgrade now, they'd be moving to something like a double or triple pane. Almost nobody's going to want to install single pane windows anymore, right? These other intermediate pathways are in the middle, are steps along the way as well. But what we really need to get towards is the zero carbon ready and then to the max site. So this really sort of depends on where your building is at. So it applies to these different clusters, and I'm happy to get into the technical if anybody wants to dig into that a little bit more, but it's probably beyond the depth of today's conversation. So all of these packages, we looked at the cost to implement these packages, the life cycle costs that the building would go through with that, and the incremental life cycle cost per ton. So in the real estate industry and for any building, that capital is the main decision-making tool, which, because energy costs typically are such a small portion of buildings capital, especially in today's hot market, it's really, really important to look at those capital costs. So here's one example for a multi-unit residential building. And as you can see here in this building, looking at this baseline package, in the next 30 years, they're likely to spend about $30 per square foot doing capital upgrades. Looking at pushing this a little bit further, it's not actually a huge increase to shift towards this fuel switching ready package, and it gets actually really close to the price of carbon. But we need to get a lot further to achieve our net zero goal. And, it's good to note that the cost of making this transition is much higher, than the price of carbon. Similarly, for a large institutional, commercial, or industrial building, as you can see, their costs are much higher than the price of carbon, right? So, and none of these packages offer cost savings over just doing the basic life cycle, like for similar. So, we know that the finances alone are not going to drive this without, significant other investment. It's interesting to look as well that this zero carbon ready is actually pretty close in cost to, the max site to the MERB example as well, a little bit higher. So, how do we make these more cost effective? Well, maybe we need higher carbon pricing to reflect some of the true social and environmental costs. The other part that will really help is that supply chain and workforce development, which will help to lower capital costs, making some of these retrofits more prescriptive, enabling economies of scale, and applying some of those incentives to the capital costs to make these a little more achievable. Also this investment over time is really important to consider in this strategy, because you can look at when you're making these upgrades that are in the capital plan now, moving towards something that's ready to make a switch to heat pumps is only a marginal increase in life cycle costs. So it's a smart move to start pushing buildings to do this now. And, this is an opportunity for us as a municipality. right? So here's a potential pathway for increasing these performance targets over time, where you can look at, right now getting that 0 to 30% savings, that can be achieved doing the business as planned, like for similar, right? Shifting up into the higher tiers over time, we envision something like starting with requiring, a path with being fuel switch ready, and starting, fuel switching to electric heat pumps for other buildings. And, getting close to the end of that timeline, it's completing the rest of those measures that need to be done to get the rest of the way there to the full net zero building. So out of this is probably the most important slide on how we're going to start getting there. And the one that I probably want to talk the most about today, it's the pathway of what are our first steps to achieve all of these things that we need to do that we're all very anxious about and a little bit unsure about how to get there. Especially with the accelerated action. I think this provides a bit of a strain on what we need to do in the short term. So, also thinking about the impacts on people is really important. And so the first part of that importance comes down to data. And, currently, data on building performance is only collected for a very limited set of buildings. You have large buildings in Ontario through energy and water reporting and disclosure regulations, where you have the buildings over 100,000 square feet reporting, and you have that being expanded very shortly to over 50,000 square feet. But it still doesn't cover smaller buildings. We have data from the broader public sector from earlier legislation. Again, it primes this area of buildings for some of the first action on developing emissions performance targeting and disclosure regulations. So they're going to be some of the first ones that are going to be required to report. But we're going to need data. I'm going to come back to this slide. Here, as you can see, for smaller buildings as well, this is a potential phase-in plan where in the near term, we're looking to encourage voluntary data reporting, transitioning to mandatory through the decade, and, moving this from large buildings first into smaller and single family homes later. And how we report this data is going to be very different. So, I think it's important to remember for an average homeowner, this has to be really low burden. So, they might not be reporting directly versus, it might be a utility data disclosure direct from the utility, right? So, getting into those mechanisms is, one of the next problems as well. Similarly, for that second part, which you saw on the schedule as well, it's those emissions performance targets. So once we have that data, setting those targets for what buildings need to achieve and phasing these in over time is a critical part to achieving our targets as well. So again, this is likely be rolled out to the biggest buildings first, with voluntary compliance required to participate in city programs in the very short term, moving to mandatory requirements over time. And thirdly, for the building performance measures, we'd also be looking at requiring energy and emissions audits and tune-ups. So identifying where performance is slipping, where we need to do retro commissioning or work to improve building performance. So really important to have someone on top of a building's performance and to continuously monitor and evaluate. right? The next area that's really, really critical as well is providing the support and resources to actually make these deep retrofits easy and affordable. So knowledge, you know, it's a new subject area that most people don't have enough experience to just dive in and start making changes, right? So we need to provide a one-stop shop, as they call it, providing integrated retrofit support to building owners who are undergoing these upgrades. So you want to be able to provide the information that they need, connect them with the correct services they need, you know, and handhold throughout the process, essentially. We also need to expand the financing for retrofits. Since these don't have a payback and they're, you know, they provide benefits over a very long period of time, you know, focusing on long-term, low-cost financing is critical to enabling these projects as well. We see a little bit of this, you know, coming very shortly from the federal government for the Greener Homes Loan Program. We have our home energy loan program in Toronto that is also moving to a zero interest rate, you know, to support transformative projects as well. And then also through the permitting process and the approvals process, we need to support deep retrofits there as well. So we need to make sure that we're, you know, providing the options to move to the highest performance. We're, you know, providing some flexibility where required to enable deep retrofits as well, and understand that, you know, these concessions need to be made to enable these projects as well, right? And thirdly, we need to work with other levels of government to enable this. So one of the critical aspects I mentioned in the last point was knowledge, right? We need that awareness. What is a deep retrofit? You know, who can tell me what is a deep retrofit who doesn't work in this space very commonly? There's not a large awareness. When we think about electrifying heating systems, people think back to you know, the increasing costs of electric heat, you know, from all the electric buildings from the 70s, right? You think about that in terms of, you know, high electricity rates. This is no longer true. You know, an efficient heat pump in Toronto's climate can provide heat at the same level of cost as natural gas, right? But there's this barrier to get over this prejudice that people have against electric heat. Similarly, for contractors and installers, they also need to get over the barrier and understand how to size, sell, you know, and promote these decarbonization technologies, right? So that's part of the supporting workforce development and training as well. You know, enabling this transition. You know, if you specifically go out and look to convert to a heat pump, you know, I can tell you from you know, the cost side as an engineer in the space, it costs me the same amount of money to heat my home with a heat pump or a gas furnace, right? But this isn't the advice you're getting in the industry. So there needs to be a big shift to support that and share some of that knowledge and develop some of those skills in the workforce as well. Similarly, making things like envelope improvements where we need to come a long way from where we are now. So a big action for the city is to advocate for some of the action at other levels of government. You know, there's things like looking at the alterations to existing buildings code that's supposed to be coming, right? We're looking to push for higher performance in building codes. You know, looking for some of the finance and capacity building supports, right? So these are really, I'd say, the critical actions coming out of the strategy and our first steps for the short term before we can require buildings to, make a bigger change. So, implementation planning. We're talking right now in the city about how to best introduce these actions that I've talked about. As I mentioned, it's going to be on a voluntary basis first and transition over time to mandatory. So some of that voluntary basis, maybe if you want to participate in a city financing program, you'd be required to perform this disclosure and reporting as well, right? And we're going to base this mandatory transition on those next learnings and further engagement. The other part of that is we're going to start with some of the bigger buildings that we have better data for first. So those requirements will be really aligned with what's required for data. So through this process, a lot of this is going to start, scaling up this year. So we're really interested in, further consultation and engagement with stakeholders. So if there is anybody who wants to be part of those consultations, please send us an email. I think one of the next big steps for this year that we're going to be starting really soon as well is looking at the equity and affordability impacts. So I think I was mentioning before, some of these measures, can reduce energy costs for homeowners and for tenants, but they come at the cost of high capital costs. So it's a really interesting, problem to dive into. So here's the scenario again for Toronto. What's going to have to happen in the next, contemplated to 2050, but now needs to be accelerated to the next 18 years. We need all older buildings to undergo an upgrade to enclosure and heating systems, right? All buildings, those older ones, and even any newer ones using natural gas-fired heating, they will be required to undergo a fuel switch to electric heat pumps off of gas. Buildings also need to install renewables. In Toronto, the big one is solar, but this is going to offset about 14% of the electricity for those buildings we looked at. So really important as well to help limit electricity grid growth, but we are still going to be a large importer of power. We can reach 80% emissions reductions, but we can't fully get to zero, largely because of those grid electricity emissions that I mentioned before. And the biggest takeaway is that these measures don't have a simple payback, when you're talking about, the capital cost for these projects. So it's really critical that someone in the shoes of a municipality who can think about the community benefits can incorporate some of the, social, environmental, health benefits. And, this needs to be done at a province and federal level as well. Things like, considering what the electricity system benefits are to go to, let's say, ground source heat pumps rather than air source heat pumps. Not usually enough of a cost savings for a building owner, but is there a business case for the benefits this provides at a electricity system level? So there's still a lot of questions that need to be answered that way, and a lot of work to be done with different levels of government. So we're almost ready to wrap up here, and I wanted to mention some of the other co-benefits here, especially where we talk about some of these large commercial buildings where deep retrofits can be enabled for other reasons as well. Organizations, environmental social responsibility goals, and a zero carbon mandate could drive this, same as, benefiting tenant retention for the same reasons, where they're looking to be in a high performance building. So some of the deeper investment is, more worthwhile with lower capital costs as well. But we need something else to support, driving this change, be it much stronger carbon pricing or other financial supports, right? Again, these are the city programs that we offer. Always happy to talk about any of them, especially if you know anybody who would fit into them. And we're looking to expand some of these as well in the near future. So hopefully these can help some people out. So thank you very much. And I'm open to discussing or questions or anything else, if there's any details you want to dive into today. I think we can also share a link to the strategy, which I highly encourage people to read through as well, as a great resource.
Thanks so much, Devon. I really appreciate that. And it's nice to kind of see the pathway. I think one of the things that I got from when I was reviewing the existing building strategy, which I will put a link in the chat for folks, is just that the economic business case is not going to win this on its own. There has to be a better value proposition outside of just using energy cost savings to really drive the action that we need. One of the curious questions you were mentioning is that based on the internal consultations that have taken place in the City of Toronto, how much dependence do we have on the province for the authorities that municipalities would need? That if the province doesn't enact it, how would the municipalities be able to gain the authority? Which authorities is it the municipality needs to gain to be able to act on their opportunities?
So I can at least talk about this high level, and it would be great to, coordinate a little bit more on this, because I think this is a big part of the ask. So when we're looking at implementing emissions performance requirements, that's not something we have the power to do right now. So we 100% need the province on board with allowing measures like that. Similarly, I think if we were aiming to implement a Toronto-specific step code, a building step code, or an alterations to existing buildings code, again, we don't have the authority here to just do that as is. And that's probably a pretty critical action, if we're thinking about some of the local considerations. I think the picture ends up being a little bit different across the province and across the country, depending on some of these design considerations. Like you think about, if you look at Toronto, where we're downtown, we might, we can move to heat pumps completely, because our design temperatures here are within the range that heat pumps can operate year round, right? So that's technically possible. And so that might be a reason why Toronto should have a step code that requires more than the province in a shorter time. But it's certainly something we need to work with other municipalities to bring to Ontario and start the conversation on enabling this transition, right? If this is something that we all really want to do, and it's our goal to hit this by 2040, it needs to go to the province right away.
Gabby, you're on mute.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Sorry. The other question is how you're working with the utilities and the electricity grid, and how to kind of work together with City of Toronto, Toronto Hydro, and the overall need to work together to address grid constraints.
Yeah, 100%. So, this is something we need to think about, when we're talking about existing buildings and what we're going to do with them electrically. So, two big aspects of this, I'd say. Maybe three, actually. So the first one that I mentioned earlier in this is super, super critical. So the only way this can work is to do envelope upgrades to these buildings along with electrifying them. You need those envelope upgrades to limit the peak demand on electricity grids as well. So that's really critical. When we're talking about these upgrades, we need to be thinking about the impacts of electrifying the building's heating system, but also about adding electric vehicle chargers. So the two really go hand in hand, and need to be attacked in a coordinated manner. So the third aspect, which is our local electricity grid. So Toronto Hydro brought a report to council at the same time as our net zero strategy in December. And they contemplate that they need to invest about $10 billion into grid upgrades to enable this transition. So, really significant investment as well. And that's a critical portion, for our local distribution grid. When you start thinking a little bit broader, we really need to push the province to expand transmission capacity where required, and mainly to decarbonize electricity generation even further, right? So there's a lot of interactive effects, and thinking about how you manage peak demand with be it batteries or pump storage, or incenting using ground source versus air source heat pumps. All of that should be considered by the province.
Right. Yeah. And one of the things I thought was really quite interesting is how Toronto City Council played a role in pushing Toronto Hydro to develop their climate action plan that is supposed to identify how it needs to work with the City of Toronto to see the City of Toronto approach. And it's one of the strategies I would encourage other municipalities, and it's something we'll kind of talk about, but there needs to be a lot more integration across the climate action plans and the role the utilities play in helping to achieve those plans. And I know that Toronto, it's not like Toronto Hydro came in willingly saying, we'll develop our own little climate action plan. No, they actually had to be directed to do so by the City of Toronto Council. But I think it's progress happening.
It's true, although I won't dive too deeply on that. We've had some conversations, and I think there can be more done. The big thing I like pointing out around that is it was about 5 to 7, maybe 7 years ago now, where the Ontario Energy Board put in place regulations to allow electric utilities to do on-bill financing for energy efficiency measures. A lot of what's being done can be considered electric energy efficiency, right? And, so far, there's limited or no uptake of this. I think that this is really an area where municipalities or the province have an opportunity to coordinate with utilities to drive a bit of a transition. And that might even connect into things like, federally, the Canadian Infrastructure Bank's financing programs or others, to enable, some of this large scale fuel switching. So I think that's really, really important. And, then additionally, the potential of your local utility as a partner to help implement this plan. A lot of them got pretty good at some of that, running some of the past conservation programs back when utilities delivered them. So, you know, we know they can help with some of these actions. It's just a matter of getting everything in place to make that happen.
Perfect. All right. One of the other, I did want to kind of give this as a little bit of a teaser. One of the next kind of actions that we're going to need to kind of work across municipalities and with the province on is what are the asks that municipalities have related to what they need. Certainly energy disclosure, energy labeling, being like, if the province doesn't do a retrofit code, that's another kind of question about how the retrofit code that's coming from the feds gets implemented at the provincial level. And if it doesn't happen at the provincial level, what opportunities are there to implement this at the municipal level as a starting point to build capacity or comfort and then eventually move towards the province. But there's going to need to be some significant work across a whole bunch of municipalities on what is it exactly that municipalities need to act on their climate change opportunities. And again, ideally makes sense to do it at the provincial level, but there might be very good reasons why we might need to advance it at the municipal level first before getting buy-in to do something like this at the provincial level. Mm-hmm. And, oh, sorry, go ahead, Devon.
No, I was just saying, certainly.
And then I see some folks are kind of curious about, so one of the things we're going to be doing is a little bit of brainstorming amongst the staff to see exactly, because there has been some conversations on what is a climate change bylaw, what can it do, but there is caveats in the update to the Municipal Act and the City of Toronto Act that doesn't enable the climate change bylaws authorities just as yet. So we do need to work in conjunction with the province to enact those ones or to get comfort at the municipal level to be able to enact them. So that's something that's on the radar. I see existing building strategies are critical because the ability and authority that municipalities have in existing buildings is much, much, much less than they have in new buildings. So our site plan controls are not going to be useful at all in the existing building strategy, except for a few ones where there is a site, it does trigger a site plan work, which is a rare thing, my understanding. So there's work on that one. Is there any thoughts of expanding to a virtual GTHA delivery center to help us drive this beyond Toronto, where individual municipalities could participate by sharing in costs, perhaps on a per capita share? Absolutely. I think that there's opportunities. We have to be creative about how we do this. It's a huge endeavor, not a lot of resources. So you know that there is the need to work collectively on that one. And so we need to advance that. I think one of the first things that we probably would need before we go to that type of model is we probably need more existing building strategies, action plans, getting in front of municipal councils for them to sign on to this, to get the business case planning taking place for how we move this forward. Because while existing buildings are in your in every climate action plan that I've seen thus far, the details of what it needs, what the actions that need to happen in order to make that is something that you probably would need to have a lot more council education and awareness building, because we are going to probably need to work with councils to engage in that provincial municipal dialogue moving forward. So that's the one. I'm going to launch some web polls. I'm hoping you can see that. I'm going to rely on you guys because I can't see what's happening now with these polls. But it might, I think you are voting. I think, yeah, oh yeah, it's working.
I'm glad. Yeah, and I just added to the chat as well.
Oh, thank you. Thanks, Devon.
Links to the net zero existing building strategy and the Toronto Hydro Climate Action Plan, which helps answer some of the questions. So I saw a question as well about if LDCs are restricted to participating since they're out of the conservation business. The Toronto Hydro Climate Action Plan has Toronto's hydro's take on this, but I'd say the short answer is no. They have pathways they can take to do this without it. It's going to cut into their profits or dividend, that's paid out. So, there's a choice by municipalities or owners on how this needs to be accomplished. The other part of that is that, more can be done as well in the deregulated business as well, even more potentially, lending the trust that those utilities have to some of this really important process. And, again, I'd love to see Ontario doing a little bit more with enabling, something like on-bill financing for this across the province, right? Yeah.
And I do admit, we have been having a number of conversations with some utilities in the hopes of actually being able to gain utility engagement on the on-bill financing to streamline a financial mechanism for energy efficiency retrofit programs. Because the idea, like there are 444 municipalities in Ontario, and there are I think now we're about 65 electrical utilities. One of the key challenges on this one is that we haven't had the engagement on them. Even if I was really trying to work with Hydro One on this one, because the idea of doing advancing home energy efficiency retrofits at the municipal level in very small communities in very rural parts of Ontario honestly makes me want to run screaming, scared to death out of trying to do that. So there's got to be a better way to do that. And we do need a utility to come into this space to engage with us. At present, they only seem to be wanting to engage unless it's like a conservation demand management strategy that they could use CDM funds, but they don't have CDM funds right now, so they haven't been engaging in the way that they do. The other thing that I think has been a bit of a challenge, and I'm going to be a little bit frank on this one, is that the creativity that's coming out of the utility programs is something that they really need to work more as a team approach. Their traditional practices have been that they run their own CDM programs, or they design it and they make it work for what the box they have to fit into. But that doesn't necessarily always mean the customer oriented approach that a lot of these retrofit programs are really going to have to up their game on to respond to the needs of the residential sector as they are right now, not what works for the government. And we know that there's challenges on doing that, but it is one of the silver linings associated with how these retrofit programs are being delivered at the municipal level or being advanced at the municipal level. It does allow a lot more room for creativity. You lose some efficiency of scale, but you do get some creativity benefits coming out of it. So win some, lose some.
Certainly. And I just saw another question in the chat, which I would like to answer on this on-bill financing really quickly. So I would say it works exactly the same way as, you think about your furnace rental from Enercare or Reliance right now, except if we make something like this public, we keep the interest rate down, we lower those service costs, and it could be much more cost effective. So think about paying for your heat pump system in your single family home that costs about the same as a new air conditioner and furnace, paying it on your electricity bill, broken down into easy monthly payments over 20 years instead of on your gas bill. So I don't think it's very different that way. There still needs to be an incentive to drive some of the bigger action, though.
Yeah. And one of the things that I think it really helped to build some insight on how the government policies play with building up the market for the retrofits is California does provide a good example of that, because they are the most advanced PACE market at present. But it's also really interesting to notice that it's not just the energy efficiency or renewables that's driving the retrofit market in California. It is actually a lot of the times the seismic upgrades that need to happen to buildings to enable them to pass regulations, and then that affects the resale price of these buildings. If they don't have the seismic upgrades, that's going to affect the demand for the building because they know this work needs to get done. So it goes to show how the government policies and the market helps to drive the market, and how you can bring these variety of different goals together. Because I see one of the benefits associated with advancing home energy efficiency retrofit programs, whatever model, on-bill financing, municipal LIC, whatever the kind of financing mechanism are, is that you build this foundational piece that you could then build into resilience. You can build on radon. You can build living on. I'm dropping the name now. When seniors want to stay in their home, living.
Age in place.
Age in place. Thank you.
Yeah.
So all of these can get brought together, but they can all exist on the similar foundation. And it's building that foundation that is a huge challenge right now, but it helps to show that it's not only just about the retrofit programs, it's about advancing a whole bunch of other government policies as well.
Yep. And we're looking at expanding our PACE programs as well here. So, we definitely see that as a path to supporting further decarbonization.
All right, perfect. So thank you so much, Devon. I really appreciate you taking this. Thanks everyone for participating in this and joining this webinar. We will be sharing out the recording to share with others in your jurisdiction who you think will be interested or who you think should bloody well be interested in this work. and then we're also going to be coming back to you. There is the Ontario Building Code that is being updated at present. We're just working at present. It's not making as much progress in terms of what the government is suggesting at present. There are also some concerns with regards to not bringing in the different tiers from the National Model Building Code and just choosing one tier and only putting that reference in the Ontario Building Code. So there's some draft kind of submissions I'm going to be sending out to the Clean Air Council network for your input, and we will be having a future webinar to discuss that before we put our submission in. But it does speak to the need for all of us to work together on identifying the specific asks of what is it that municipalities need the authorities to do, and then developing a strategy for how to engage with the province. This is something that probably will need to take place post-election. The bandwidth will probably not be there at the early stages of this, but it's something that we need to kind of get our own house in order so that we're better able to engage with the province post-election, so like the fall probably of 2022. Great, and thank you so much for filling out the polls. I'm so glad they worked. We've been struggling to try and figure out why our polls weren't working, but that is fixed now. And I'll send out the recording, send out things. If there's additional topics that you'd like to kind of dig into, please let us know, and we will set up future time periods for those discussions. Again, thanks so much, Devon, for taking us on a tour of the existing building strategy. Really appreciate that.
Thanks, Gabby.
Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.
Have a good day.